that we need to look specifically at Iraq because this is where it's really exploded. The fact is that there are no longer enough active duty forces to sustain the occupation, and so they've accelerated the use of the private sector. And the problem lies where Blackwater is now doing a job in guarding the senior U.S. diplomats in Iraq that traditionally was done by the Diplomatic Security Corps. That's been dramatically outsourced. And you're creating a tier system where you're saying our active duty forces aren't as important monetarily as these private forces. And I think you create a real crisis of morale within the military when you have the private sector paid, in some cases, exponentially more than your active duty forces. And again, I think we have to put as our priority the democratic process in this country. And the fact is that when you have forces that are not accountable, whose operations Congress can't even get a hold of, that's a real problem. And so it's not just a simple matter of crunching numbers and whether or not the active duty military should do a job. Privatization is the real issue, and the dangers that comes with that of such a radical privatization. The danger is that there's no oversight, and I think that's what Congress is starting to realize is at play.
I remember the first time I sort of tumbled to the importance of these military contractors in the conduct of military operations was in Bosnia. And I went to the base, the main base at Tuzla, and all of the food services were contracted out, and the base, in fact, I think had been built by a contractor. But where did they, that's basically providing logistical services. And there's an old saying that amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. Have you been able to identify a crossover line where these contractors became integral to U.S. military operations?
Yes. Well, in part. First of all, this all really started in its current form when Dick Cheney was Defense Secretary under George H.W. Bush. And one of the last things he did, you probably recall, David, before leaving office, was to commission a study from a division of Halliburton, the company he would go on to head. And that study looked at how to greater privatize the military bureaucracy. But it was the servicing of the military, as you mentioned, the laundry, the food services, anything that wasn't combat in its orientation. In the mid-1990s, there was one contract that the Clinton administration authorized that sort of changed the equation a bit. Clinton allowed a private military firm called MPRI, Military Professional Resources Incorporated, based in Virginia, to go into Croatia during the Yugoslav Civil War and to train the Croatian military. The Croatian military turned around and carried out a blitzkrieg called Operation Storm and Lightning, in which they expelled about 250,000 Serbs from the Krajina. The New York Times called that the single greatest ethnic cleansing of the war. But what it did is it turned the Yugoslav Civil War in favor of the U.S. position. And it happened by putting a few boots on the ground, a couple of retired military guys who talked strategy with the Croatian military, and they were able to affect change in a very radical way on behalf of the U.S. goals in the region. And that is viewed, I think, in the industry and among the scholars who've studied this as a real turning point. They actually were on the ground engaging with a foreign military that was an ally of the United States, and it was a successful operation from the viewpoint of the Clinton administration.
Now, when Dick Cheney was Defense Secretary, that was, of course, when the Cold War ended, and the biggest issue he dealt with was what was called the downsizing of the U.S. military, scaling it back now that you no longer had to compete against the Soviet military. And the size of the Army was basically cut in half. So isn't this a logical extension, his commissioning these studies? Isn't that a logical extension of the end of the Cold War?
Oh, I think that that's very much what Cheney and Rumsfeld certainly envisioned. I mean, I think that their global view when it comes to the running of the war machine is to run it more like a venture capital firm than a bureaucracy. In fact, you may recall in September of 2001, on September 10th, 2001, Rumsfeld gave this major address in which he said that governments can't die, and so we need to find other incentives to keep competition alive. And I think that they're very militant disciples of the free market system, and they believe in the private sector's role in government, period, not just in the military.
It happened, I think, too late to get into your book, but when David Petraeus was going through his confirmation hearings, he was to be the new commander in Iraq. He was asked if he had enough troops, and with this surge and the Iraqi forces that are being added to Baghdad. He figured he was going to have 85,000 troops when traditional counterinsurgency doctrine told him he needed 120,000 just for Baghdad. And his answer to this gap was, well, there are tens of thousands of contractors doing jobs that we don't have to do, which I think does make the point of how integral they have become in these operations. But what would happen if, pick your contractor, Halliburton, Blackwater, whoever, decided it was simply too dangerous to operate there anymore? Could we say, hey, you have to stay, we need you?
Yeah, I'd be very surprised if that happened. No, the U.S. Military nor the administration could order a company to stay in the war zone, and that's one of the things on the ground that differentiates a soldier from a private soldier. If a soldier abandons his post, he's going to be court-martialed. If a private soldier says, forget this, I'm off the battlefield, he just leaves. And, it's too profitable. There's no way that these companies are going to pull out of Iraq. The only way they would pull out of Iraq is if Congress legislated it. Bush is not going to pull them out. In fact, the Democrats in their legislation could have 40,000 troops in Iraq at the end of 2008 and an unlimited number of contractors. This isn't even on the agenda. And you know, Rumsfeld in February of 2006 in the Pentagon's Quadrennial Review for the first time identified contractors as an official part of the U.S. total force. This was a legitimacy they couldn't have dreamed of before.
We're going to go to a break.
Afterwards and several other C-SPAN programs are available for download as podcasts. More with Jeremy Scahill and David Martin in a moment.
Now at cspan.org, order your C-SPAN 2007 Congressional Directory. Inside, House and Senate member biographies, as well as information on committees and caucuses, district maps, and the latest information on governors, cabinet members, Supreme Court justices, and more. Order your C-SPAN 2007 Congressional Directory. It's only $16.95, online at cspan.org, or by phone at 1-877-ON-C-SPAN.
Afterwards, with Jeremy Scahill and David Martin, continues.
Just going to the little bio of you on the cover here of the book. Jeremy Scahill is a Polk Award-winning investigative journalist. What is the Polk Award, and what did you win it for?
I won the Polk Award. It's one of the more prestigious awards for in journalism. It's given by Long Island University, and I won that award for a documentary I did with my colleague Amy Goodman about the Chevron Oil Corporation's operations in the oil-rich Niger Delta of Nigeria. We went over there in the summer of 1998, and we documented an incident in which the Chevron Corporation had provided its own company helicopters to one of the most notorious units of the Nigerian security forces to go in and suppress a protest on one of the company's barges, and some people were killed and injured in it. And so we did an hour-long documentary about Chevron that ended up winning the Polk Award for foreign radio reporting.
You're also a frequent contributor to The Nation magazine. I think most people have heard of The Nation, but just give us a brief description.
The Nation magazine is the oldest political news weekly in the United States, and it's a mixture of opinion and investigative reporting. So my particular role at The Nation magazine has been to investigate private military companies like Blackwater. The editor is Katrina Vanden Heuvel. Before that, it was Victor Navasky, both of them very well-known progressive thinkers and writers.
And it says you're now a writing fellow at the Nation Institute. I assume that's associated with The Nation magazine?
Yes.
And it's published by Nation Books.
Yes.
So I think I have the connection.
I'm a one-beat guy, I guess.
I think for most people, if they've heard of Blackwater before, they heard about it because of what happened in Fallujah in 2004. So explain to me what happened in Fallujah.
In many ways, it was the day the war turned. It was March 31st, 2004, 9:30 in the morning. A convoy led by Blackwater made its way into the center of the city. At the front of the convoy was a Pyro Jeep with a reinforced bumper, not an armored vehicle. Sitting in that Jeep were 2 Blackwater contractors. Behind that, there were 3 empty flatbed trucks being driven by Iraqi drivers. And then taking up the rear was another Pyro Jeep with 2 other Blackwater contractors. And their mission that day was to go to one end of Fallujah, pick up some kitchen equipment, and bring it back to the other end of Fallujah. At 9:30, they roll into the center of the city. They hit some sort of a roadblock. And within moments, the rear vehicle, the rear Pyro Jeep, is attacked by Iraqi insurgents. They shoot up the vehicle. They begin to tear apart the men inside. The lead vehicle turns around to either get off the X, meaning to get off the scene, or to turn around and help their comrades. And they, too, are overtaken by insurgents. And within moments, the original attackers disappear into the side streets of Fallujah, and a mob descends on the convoy, and they literally tear the men apart. They burn the men, they loot their bodies and take their possessions, and hundreds of people are dancing in the streets. They tie some of them to the back of a car, drive them through the streets of Fallujah, and eventually 2 of their bodies, charred, lifeless bodies, were hung from a bridge over the Euphrates River. One young man in the crowd held up a homemade sign that said, "Fallujah is the graveyard of the Americans." And for many people, it was the first that they'd ever heard of contractors operating in Iraq, not to mention private military contractors. In fact, some of the headlines that day say 4 American civilians mutilated in Iraq. But they weren't civilians, nor were they active duty military. They were private military contractors for Blackwater. And what happened after that was the siege of Fallujah. The U.S. military surrounded the city. I actually think that the Marines didn't want to take the kind of approach that ended up happening as a result of the Blackwater ambush. The Bush administration ordered a massive attack on the city, and that was the first of several sieges of Fallujah. They carried out 37,000 airstrikes, destroyed 19,000 buildings. Hundreds of people were killed. Scores of U.S. soldiers were killed in the various sieges of Fallujah as well. But what it did, David, is it inflamed the Iraqi resistance because at that time you already had Muqtada al-Sadr's Shiite forces rising up against the U.S. in Iraq. You had the Sunnis beginning to increasingly engage in resistance, and Paul Bremer had fired about 250,000 Iraqi soldiers as part of his de-Baathification program. So you had a real, you had a real volatile situation. The Fallujah ambush happens, the U.S. lays siege to the city, and all of a sudden you have an outbreak of very overt violent resistance in Iraq.
You say they were going through Fallujah to pick up kitchen equipment?
Right. Blackwater was operating on a contract with the world's largest catering services company. It's a company called ESS. And who ESS was ultimately contracted to, whether it was KBR or Fluor, would become the subject of a multi-year investigation by Representative Henry Waxman. So these men literally died for pots and pans. And their families all thought they were going over to Iraq to protect Paul Bremer. That's what Blackwater was doing at the time in Iraq. And so when it turned out that they, in fact, were dying for kitchen equipment, these families started to ask some very serious questions about what their loved ones were doing over there.
My first question would be, what was anybody doing in Fallujah in an unarmored vehicle?
Right. The U.S. military certainly wouldn't have gone into Fallujah in 2 Pajero Jeeps with reinforced bumpers. And so one of the things that's happened is that the families of those 4 guys have sued Blackwater. And what's come out of their lawsuit is some very interesting facts about that mission that day. According to the contract they operated under, they were supposed to have armored vehicles. They were supposed to have 3 men to a vehicle, a driver, a navigator, and a rear gunner who would be armed with a heavy saw machine gun. They only had 2 guys to the vehicle, meaning they had no rear gunner. They should have been in the armored vehicles. They say that they weren't provided maps of the area, that they weren't given a chance to do a pre-trip risk assessment. And what the families of those 4 guys allege is that Blackwater sent them in a haphazard way on that mission to cut corners and save $1.5 million. And they say that Blackwater was trying to impress this company, ESS. They had just won the contract from a competing private military firm. And so, you have the situation where these guys are like sitting ducks in the center of Fallujah. I think the Iraqis that attacked them believed that they were either CIA or Mossad.
Where does that lawsuit stand?
It was filed in January of 2005 in state court in North Carolina, where Blackwater is headquartered. And